Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by the ACE South Africa. And I would like to just say a couple of things about the rules and how to participate in this webinar today. So today we have Susana Molins with us. She's going to present about the iconic archive, Timbuktu and its manuscripts in public discourse. And she is based at the Historical Studies Department at the University of Cape Town. So she will be presenting today for 30 to 45 minutes. And after that, we will have time for questions for Q&A. So please feel welcome to write in the chat or directly in the Q&A. So towards the end of the session, we can discuss your questions. So far, we have like a webinar displayed. So it means that you cannot directly enter into conversation, but we will be pleased to, at the end of the presentation, to unmute you if you want to address directly the speaker from today. So again, a very warm welcome to everyone here today. And I'm just gonna play the video from the ambassador to present Dr. Susana Molins.
Good afternoon and welcome to the 6th 2021 webinar organized by the Embassy of Spain together with the Society of Spanish Researchers in South Africa. Under the title, Iconic Archive, Timbuktu and its Manuscripts in Public Discourse, today's webinar is given by Dr. Susana Molins, Associate Researcher at the Archive and Public Culture Research Initiative, Historical Studies Department at the University of Cape Town. Dr. Molins will speak about the Timbuktu archive, tracing and examining the evolving and competing ideas and narratives that emerged and were mobilized around Timbuktu and its manuscripts in African, Western, and Islamic context. I hope you will find it interesting. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being here today with us, Susana. We're looking forward to hear your presentation, and hopefully we can have a really, really insightful debate after that. All yours.
Thank you very much, Carmen, and thank you very much to the Society. I'm just going to share my screen for my presentation. I hope you can see that. I'm going to now, you can see, hopefully.
Yes.
All right, excellent. So thank you again to the Association of Spanish Researchers and the Embassy of Spain in South Africa. So this evening, I want to present to you some of my work on Timbuktu and its manuscripts. And of course, this is a bit of a more general talk, not very specific, speaking to larger themes. And I thought that that could be an appropriate topic for this context. So I will, if we have questions, please, I'll be very happy to discuss them with you in the end. So if some of you recall, at the beginning of January 2013, Timbuktu suddenly exploded in international headlines. It became one of the leading stories at the end of January 2013 about these rumors of the burning of the library of Timbuktu. And from the New York Times to the Guardian to all major newspapers carried these sensational stories about the burning of our heritage, of precious library, and so on and so forth. But of course, a few months later, couple of weeks later, these rumors were disproved. And some of these stories in the media and the international media were accompanied by these sensational pictures that you see on your screen. Some of them, this pile of ashes, these strawn boxes containing manuscripts. But this picture that you have at the bottom, where you see the manuscripts in the shelves, was in fact where the majority of manuscripts was found and were still intact in one of the libraries of Timbuktu. A couple of months later, we had suddenly Timbuktu again in international headlines. And this time it was the story of the manuscripts that had been exiled to Bamako, the capital of Mali, from Timbuktu. And it was this incredible heroic sort of story about, with one particular hero, Abdelkader Haidara, that you see here in the picture, and about the story about 300,000 manuscripts that had been transported in metal trunks very perilously from Timbuktu to Bamako, which is over 800 kilometers, through pirogues, through the river, through the bandits, to safety in Bamako. And this is another moment where Timbuktu was again in the headlines of the international media. And this moment really capture the imagination again, not only of the media, but we have here, you can see some of the titles that have been published, from the really sort of sensationalist book by Joshua Hammer, The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, to a very well-researched the book Smugglers of Timbuktu, to countless other films, documentaries, and so on in different languages. So you can really see this was a moment that really captured the imagination. And the debate in these books was really positioned very much as the good Muslims of Timbuktu versus the bad Muslims, the jihadis that had tried to burn these manuscripts. And we will discuss that in a little bit more details, but it became part of this wider narrative in this moment. Of course, to understand this phenomenon of Timbuktu in the international media, we have to see that over the last decade, more or less, Timbuktu has come to signify the iconic archive of written culture in Africa. It has come to signify the legacy of this culture of learning, of writing in Sub-Saharan Africa, and not in the Arabic script, but not just in the Arabic language, but also in African languages in the Arabic script. But at the same time, Timbuktu, the word Timbuktu still conjures other meanings, specifically in Western languages, in English in particular. Timbuktu still means the most remote place imaginable, existing only in the imagination, something fanciful. From here to Timbuktu is still used in the language to mean something almost impossible, something almost existing in the imagination. So I want to ask, where do these two Timbuktus meet? How has the image of Timbuktu been transformed through and public discourse and engagements in the longue durée? So that's basically the question that I'm asking, and that we'll hope to clarify during this talk. So I argue that the Timbuktu itself has a public potency that has something to do with the intersection of the imagination and the attraction of different publics. On the one hand, African publics, on the other, Muslim publics, and on the other, Western publics. So on the one hand, we can see for African publics, Timbuktu has come to mean and to show and to demonstrate the historicity of the African continent. Thabo Mbeki in particular, for example, used Timbuktu and its scholars to show some of the learning that had occurred in the continent before the colonial occupation. For Muslim publics, Timbuktu has come to signify today part of the Islamic heritage of the Islamic scientists in a context, in a geopolitical context in which Islamic culture is being vilified because of the current geopolitical questions around so-called jihad and so on. So it has been claimed in that sense as part of this so-called Islamic heritage. And in Western publics, Timbuktu has been claimed as part of world heritage. And that comes together with a whole range of political and geopolitical implications. So I argue that it is this confluence of all of these that makes the Timbuktu archive so potent. But where did it all begin, in a sense? How can we trace this history of Timbuktu and what it has come to mean in public discourse? So of course we know that Timbuktu was founded in about 1100. And from the very beginning, the key of its founding was the crucial role of commerce in the founding of the city, of the town. Of course, some of you, I haven't shown a map here, but as most of you will know, Timbuktu lies about 14 kilometers from what is called the Niger Bend, so where the Niger River takes a bend from flowing northwards to southwards in the edge of the Sahara Desert. And it was really this strategic location between the waterways coming from the south and the desert and the so-called famous caravans of gold that saw the growth of the city and its development. In the early period after the founding of Timbuktu, a very crucial moment to understand what happened with Timbuktu is the pilgrimage of the Malian Emperor Mansa Musa to Mecca as part of his religious pilgrimage. And of course, it is quite a significant trip, this, because he stopped in Cairo on his way to Mecca. And the retinue that he was accompanying him was of such splendor that the local chroniclers in Cairo wrote about it as one of the outstanding events of the year 1323 to 1324. So the chronicles, Al-Markizi, Ibn al-Dawari, Al-Umari, and so on, made this, gave detailed accounts of the retinue, of the number of slaves and servants, of the amounts of gold that Mansa Musa brought on this trip. And they even, one of the very well-known anecdotes from this trip was that he carried so much gold that the stock market in Egypt was depreciated and the effects were felt for the next 5 years. And we see that these stories about the trip of Mansa Musa began to circulate, but not only in the Islamic world through these chronicles, but they also had an effect in the West. Here we see the famous Catalan atlas attributed to Abraham Cresques from the island of Mallorca, produced in 1375. And here we see the image of Mansa Musa sitting in his gold throne with a big nugget. And this is one of the first times we see also the appearance of Timbuktu on a map as Tambukh in this early period. And so this shows that the circulation of the accounts of the Arab chronicles made it even to the West, as this map, of course, was presented as a gift to the French king. Very important in this period, early period, was the early travelers who made the journey to the Malian Empire and to the city of Timbuktu. And one of the most notable, of course, is the globetrotter Ibn Battuta, who mentions the city for the first time. Where we have been able to trace the mention of the city in writing is to Ibn Battuta in his Rihla, or famous travel account. And this, of course, is a very well-known work that was widely circulated in the Islamic world for a long time. Of course, Ibn Battuta sometimes was accused of not being very faithful to the narrative, and some of his contemporaries accused him of lying and embellishing his accounts. However, we see that this had a great influence also in a later period when Ibn Battuta's Rihla was published in Western languages, specifically in English in the 1800s. And we see how this had we will see later, this had a very important effect on the building of the so-called myth of Timbuktu. Another one of the early travelers that was key in this period, in a later period, was Al-Hassan al-Wazan, also known, of course, as Leo Africanus, who went on a diplomatic mission to the Songhai from Morocco. And he really is one of the ones that has given a very explicit description of Timbuktu in the moment where it was really in the 1500s, which is the moment where the splendor of the city was really beginning to happen. And here we have a very famous quote from Leo Africanus, which states that in Timbuktu there are numerous judges, scholars, and priests, all well paid by the king, who greatly honors learned men. Many manuscript books coming from Barbary are sold. Such sales are more profitable than any other. And this is quite crucial here, because from Leo Africanus's account in De la Descrizione de Africa, which was published in 1550, we really get this idea of the wealth of Timbuktu, not just in terms of material wealth, gold and so on, but also the wealth of knowledge, of books. And here we really see the beginning of a certain idea of what Timbuktu could contribute. And what is important, of course, as many of you would know, is that Leo Africanus was captured. He was sold as a slave to the Pope, and he converted to Christianity. So his work was published in Italian, and very soon after translated immediately into Latin, into French, into English, and it was a very widely circulated work in the West. So this really had a founding effect about the idea of Timbuktu in the West. Of course, to understand this period, this is really the period of Timbuktu's so-called golden age, is the period of Songhai rule, which was from the 15th century to the 16th century, really. And one of the iconic rulers of this period, Askia Muhammad, himself made another pilgrimage to Makkah in 1497. And again, through this pilgrimage, the stories about Timbuktu, its riches, it as a center of knowledge, was reinforced. And here it really is the period where we see that Timbuktu really became an intellectual center in Africa, where manuscripts were being sold, they were being copied, they were being circulated, they were being taught. We read of the establishment of public libraries as well as personal libraries. And one of the most iconic scholars from this period, the famed Ahmad Baba, wrote that his personal library of 1,600 volumes was one of the smaller of the city. So in terms of understanding the scale of what was happening in Timbuktu at that time. In this period, a bit later, we see the writing of the famed historical chronicles of the region, the famed Tarikh al-Sudan and Tarikh ibn al-Mukhtar. And these chronicles were, in fact, written after the conquest of Timbuktu by the Moroccan Sultanate. However, what is important to understand from these chronicles is they promoted the image of the city as a center of Islamic scholarship and as the moral capital of the region. And it was also, the chronicles themselves were a political and intellectual project that also presented a certain unified historical narrative of the different empires that had succeeded in the region. And this is where we see this beginning of this idea that first we had the Empire of Ghana, then we had the Empire of Mali, then we have Songhai, and it really is can be traced to the 17th century chronicles. Of course, as I mentioned, in 1591, the Moroccan army conquered Songhai to control the lucrative Saharan trade. And we really see that this really brought about quite a decline in the intellectual activity of Timbuktu. A huge number of its great scholars were taken as prisoners. The scholar I mentioned earlier, Ahmad Baba, was taken in chains with his whole family to Morocco, and he was held in house arrest for the next 15 years. So really see a decline in the intellectual production in Timbuktu itself. And we see that from the concentration of intellectual production in the city, in the town, we see a gradual shift towards rural mobile lineages in areas such as present-day Mauritania and later areas such as what is today northern Nigeria, or central Mali. And we see a diffusion of these centers of knowledge production. However, at the same time, we see that this was a moment where there was an expansion, ironically, of the Timbuktu myth in the West. So as, for example, the conquering Moroccan army arrived in Marrakesh, an English merchant was there, and he saw these huge caravans with all the booty that had been brought from Timbuktu, and he began, for example, circulating these stories about the great wealth that it was found in Timbuktu. There's also stories from Portuguese traders on the coast that heard from people from the interior the news of this great city. So we see that these news and stories that were circulating and emanating from different African communities reached the different European powers, and we really begin to see the inauguration of this particular trope of Timbuktu as the inaccessible city. And this trope will be very influential in the next centuries. It really fuels this idea of what has been called a race to discover, so-called discover, of course, Timbuktu. And so Timbuktu really becomes a pole in the attraction of the European imagination. There is huge competition among European states to see who would be so-called the first to reach the mythic city. And there were several very well publicized and notorious failures to actually reach Timbuktu. So the famed explorer Mungo Park came very close, but never made it to Timbuktu. The other Scottish Alexander Gordon Laing made it to Timbuktu, sent one letter to say, I've come, I've arrived. This is one of the most incredible, I will give details, and then was killed 4 days after. So all of this fueled in the European imagination, this idea of this hidden city. During the same period, we also see the popularization of the Timbuktu myth in other areas of life. So we see renewed European interest in older Arabic travel accounts. So this is the time of the translation Ibn Battuta's Rihla, the republishing of Leo Africanus's accounts as well. And to understand the public impact of the circulation of these ideas, we can just look at the example of a poetry competition organized by Cambridge University in 1828 under the theme Timbuktu, and it was won by a young Alfred Tennyson who has a poem about the city. So you can really see how the European imagination is really being engaged around these sorts of ideas. The so-called first European, and of course we have to take this, of course, very, because many other people had reached Timbuktu, but the so-called first European explorer to arrive in Timbuktu was the Frenchman René Caillet, and he arrived in 1826. This, as we have seen, this is long after the height of Timbuktu in terms of its intellectual center, and he reaches this town. He describes, you can see here how he describes it, and he describes it as a mass of ill-looking houses built of earth and nothing else, basically. And so when his reports reached Europe, many people actually didn't believe him. There was huge competition between France and England. The French gave Caillet a huge prize, the monetary prize, but many people did not believe that he could have reached the city if that is what he described. But Hendrik Barth really is one of the explorers that was funded by the African Association based in London. And he wrote a very influential work, Travels and Discoveries in North and Central Africa. And what is interesting about Barth is he also gave that account that Timbuktu, the sort of disappointment that it was not much, but he began this idea that in fact, Timbuktu has something else. It might not have wealth in terms of money, in terms of gold, in terms of all this idea of El Dorado myth that had been circulated, but it has wealth in terms of an Islamic city of knowledge. During the colonial period, we really began to see the Orientalization of the city. So of course, Timbuktu is conquered by the French in 1897 and becomes part of the so-called French Sudan. And in Timbuktu, the French see it as a site of past glory. And in a sense, they say, you know, this what was once a great city needs to be revived. And we, the French, are going to be the ones that are going to do that. And there were huge plans, for example, to create a railway that would, you know, link Timbuktu and bring back some of its splendor. And someone that was in particular responsible for this was the French journalist Philippe Dubois, who was a journalist with Le Figaro from 1896, and he wrote this book, Timbuktu la Mystérieuse, which really began this idea about that Timbuktu as a mysterious city that hides its secrets from the outside. So you have to be almost initiated to understand what Timbuktu has to bring. So he, in his book, which was widely read in France and then translated into other languages, he popularized the idea of Timbuktu as a center of Islamic learning. He inspected works in manuscript format, but also importantly collected both written and oral accounts from local scholars and spent time with the local scholars from the city, and brought this in, put this in his writing. Of course, during the colonial period, it's important to note that the manuscripts collections of the region became very important. So, for example, one of the rulers at the time, Ahmad Sekou, who was Omar Tal's son, who were part of the two-color state, which fought against the French, and they were defeated. And of course, the French then confiscated a huge treasure, which included gold, silver, but very importantly, the library of Omar Tal, who was not just a ruler, but also a scholar. And we see that 4 trunks of manuscripts and printed documents in Arabic, Fulfulde, and French were all carried off to France. They were shipped. They remained in a warehouse, bound and deposited in the BNF. So from this period, we have this idea that manuscripts in the region began to disappear, not only through the confiscation by the French and sending them to Europe, but also local scholars fearing that their collections would suffer the same fate, would hide their manuscripts from the view. But this is not the full story, because at the same time, during the colonial period, you have the creation of new collections. So for example, we see Georges de Gironcourt, who was a French agronomist, who was in a mission in the French Sudan in the early 1900s, and he was very interested in the history of the region. So he commissioned copies of works, which he could then take home. And what is interesting about this, of course, is that he had a very selective interest in some of the manuscripts. So he would go around asking local scholars to copy for him ones of, for example, of historical importance, and he would determine what was of historical importance. So through this selection from his asking for specific things to be copied, you can see new collections being formed in this period. And similarly, in a similar period, we have what has been described by Shamil Jepi as the revival of perhaps older practices. So there was a scholar merchant, Ahmad Boularaf, who was a Moroccan, who settles in Timbuktu in 1904 and starts book collecting and trading. And he establishes a very important center for collecting manuscripts. He revives some of the older practices of copying. He had a full workshop full of copyists. He starts sending missives all over the Islamic world, from Fez to Beirut, to Cairo, to Kano in Nigeria, asking for titles and sort of reviving the manuscript trade in Timbuktu once again. And what is interesting is that, of course, he used both old networks of Islamic trade, but also the colonial postal service. And this is important to understand sort of this sort of period where one can really see the revitalization and copying industry of manuscripts in Timbuktu is revived. And of course, we have to look at the beginning of the independence period for the creation of the current manuscript repositories that we see in Mali today. And of course, we know that the 1960s is the moment of African independence. It's also a very important moment in the study of African history. I mean, we know very well that many Western historians and scholars had always regarded Africa almost as the dark continent without history and so on and so forth. And this was a moment where African scholars and historians wanted to show that, in fact, Africa had a history. So in 1967, the UNESCO proposed the creation of a regional resource and research center in Timbuktu for the collection of manuscripts. And this was meant to be a regional center. So not just collecting manuscripts from Timbuktu, from the wider region and other neighboring countries as well. So the Ahmad Baba Institute was then opened in 1973. It received funding from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And it really is the state repository and one of the most important collections in Timbuktu. In this period, it's also important to keep in mind that Timbuktu also became the Timbuktu of tourists after, of course, the 1990s, when after several periods of political instability in Mali, after a dictatorship, and when there were democratic elections in the 1990s, Timbuktu again became a destination. And here you can see that this Timbuktu of tourists retakes some of the themes that were part of the earlier period. So this idea of Timbuktu la mystérieuse becomes not just what the French had called, but the Malis themselves, as a point to attract tourists, called themselves, we are the mysterious city, come and visit us. And what happens in this period as well is what I call the decontextualization and depoliticization of the manuscripts and their heritage and their significance when they are framed in the discourse of world heritage. And I will say a little bit more about that later. We also see this beginning of what I call the neo-explorations of Timbuktu again. So this idea of the travel writing. And again, we see that Timbuktu becomes a focus of the imagination. New explorers that reach Timbuktu and write books about it, how difficult their journey was and so on. And so this contributes again to this idea of Timbuktu still being so difficult to reach, so inaccessible. Many describe when they arrive, all they see is dust and a tiny little city, but still you can say, I have been there, I have reached Timbuktu. And of course, Timbuktu also becomes a focus of meaning something else in popular culture, from a Norwegian hip hop band to important prizes for literature. It really becomes a focus of many, it's a word in itself that encapsulates many meanings for different people at different times. And from a South African point of view, of course, we know very well that during the period of former President Thabo Mbeki, South Africa established the first project of NEPAD, which was a South-to-South initiative, a direct collaboration between South Africa and Mali. What is interesting here is that Mbeki made Mali part of his African Renaissance discourse of revitalizing Africa, not just from an economic point of view, but also from a cultural and intellectual point of view. So South Africa sponsored the building of the new building of the Ahmad Baba Institute, the state repository, of private funds. This was not state funds, but were huge collections made here in South Africa, private donations, and so on, and the building of this state-of-the-art archive facility in Timbuktu. At the same time, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, we see the emergence of private family collections. And this is a very important moment because so far we had seen the state depository, but in this moment with as I mentioned, the democratization in Mali and so on, we began to see this, what I've called the explosion of these private family collections from about 5 in the late 90s to about 21 in 2008. And by 2011, we see more than 108. And these private libraries really pose interesting questions in terms of the tension that arises between their collections being private property, the private property of the families, and also their status as World Heritage. And we can discuss some of these tensions a little bit later. So just, and of course, how are these private libraries sustained? Many of them through donor funding, foundations, mainly from the West. And there's also the creation of a local NGO, Savama that put together a lot of these private collections. And really, we can see that this reaches all different corners. For example, here you see the example of one particular collection, the so-called Fondocati, or the Andalusian Library of Timbuktu, that repositioned its collection in terms of the genealogical links to Al-Andalus, and of course received funding from the regional government of Andalusia for the building of its collection and library in Timbuktu. And here we see really an explosion in terms of numbers. And again, somehow this trope of that we have been discussing of Timbuktu as outstanding wealth, now suddenly becomes the trope of the outstanding wealth in the numbers of manuscripts. So it evokes the potency of the mythical Timbuktu of gold. From, there were estimates in the early 2000s that Timbuktu maybe had about 50,000 manuscripts to suddenly 300,000 manuscripts that were in Bamako alone. And so this again reinforces this idea of Timbuktu and this mythical potency and so on. And I just, to finish off so we have enough time, I just want to look at some of these problems with, and what I've spoken about, these tensions between what happens when the archive of Timbuktu is viewed through the lens of World Heritage. So we can see that in the 2000s, a huge number of projects, the Ford Foundation, Norway, South Africa, Luxembourg were involved with the manuscripts of Timbuktu in different digitization, conservation programs. And of course, after the crisis of 2012, 2013, when the manuscripts were transported from certain numbers of collections were transported to Bamako, we see the explosion of these conservation projects as well. In particular, the German Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Gerde Henkel Foundation, both German, and a foundation from the Netherlands contributed to this moving of the manuscripts to Bamako. And the digitization efforts right now are being spearheaded by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, which is based at the University of St. John in the USA. And some of the few libraries that remained at Timbuktu, some of the private collections, some of them have been affiliated with the Endangered Archives program based at the British Library in terms of digitization efforts. And here I just want to say a few issues that arise from some of these projects. So of course, when the manuscripts were still in Timbuktu, some of the objectives were also to revitalize economic and tourist opportunities in Timbuktu, the dissemination of knowledge, and making the content available. But what we see is that some of the challenges of these projects is that very often the projects are formulated by outside experts, and they're not suitable to local conditions or epistemic practices. There's a huge emphasis, dependence on donor funding. So if the funding dries up, there's a lack of sustainability to many of these projects. And of course, there's a lack of standardized norms. So each donor will impose his own technical standards or conventions, and therefore there's huge variability in terms of the different digitization or conservation projects. And very importantly for me is there is an underestimation of the local conservation and knowledge production practices, which are contained in the researches in Timbuktu, and therefore this leads to work of standards which are not applicable to the local conditions. And with digitization, it's the same issue. We can see in the early days, the manuscripts were being microfished, and now who can read microfiche? So we see the same type of problems in Timbuktu. Of course, digitization carries with it huge amount of cost, and there's a very slow pace of work. You can imagine more than 300,000 manuscripts of different lengths to be digitized requires huge amounts of time, huge amounts of equipment, of just space, physical, space in the computer equipment and so on. So all of these are some of the challenges of these projects. But more specifically, also, it's to consider the local characteristics of the manuscript. So the manuscript tradition in West Africa is different, for example, from Islamic traditions elsewhere, in that these are not bound manuscripts, these are loose leaf manuscripts, which are not numbered. So often this causes quite a number of problems for people that are not familiar with the manuscripts of this region. Of course, some manuscripts might be too damaged to be handled. And when you digitize, of course, you cannot look at questions of paper, which is critical for us as researchers, because many of these manuscripts are undated. So when we study the manuscripts, the paper itself, the ink, give us clues in terms of the dating. And of course, in a digitized version, you do not get some of this information. And a huge debate, and an important one to have, is intellectual property issues. So there has been a lot of concern, in particular from the manuscript directors of the private libraries, of the public library as well, in terms of making the manuscripts available online. There's a tendency to think that making manuscripts available online democratizes access. But in fact, this is a very quite a contrived notion, because it democratizes access for whom? Of course, if you're sitting in your air-conditioned office in North America or Europe and have huge bandwidth, these manuscripts all being online is fantastic for you. You can download them, you can look at them without a problem. But if you're a researcher sitting in Timbuktu in Mali without electricity, with almost very little access to bandwidth, where you access your internet perhaps through your telephone, mobile telephone, downloading huge data from manuscripts as huge files is almost impossible. So many of these digitization projects, in fact, make it easy for researchers in the global north, we could say, to have access to them, but local researchers and students would not have the same type of access. So this is some of the concerns of many of the manuscript collectors and directors of the local libraries, and many of the donors that give funding for this digital projects always impose that they must keep a copy in their own repositories. And this causes quite a large discomfort for many of the people. And finally, there's also cultural heritage issues which are not taken into account. So very often in the West, the manuscripts are seen as objects of research, when in the families, for example, that keep them, they are seen as family heritage. And this provokes certain tensions as well. And of course, there are manuscripts of religious significance, which need to be handled in a certain manner. So there's concerns about how they're being handled, by whom, where they're being taken, where are they going to be seen. And of course, some of these documents are letters there. They have content about people and families that are still alive today. So records of merchants, of wills, and that type of thing, which some families might find sensitive. So what do you do with that type of documentation? So these are some of the concerns that are raised by some of the manuscript, the manuscript directors of the different collections in Timbuktu. So finally, to conclude, I just want to just give some reflections of this idea of Timbuktu as iconic archive. So I argue that there's a new myth that has been created about Timbuktu, which is fueled by the romanticized rediscovery in international media. And at the same time, the changing publicness of Timbuktu exemplifies the mutual constitution across time of archives, public, political, and academic and scholarly discourse and practice. And as I've said, Timbuktu's iconicity is related to its unique place and intersection of worlds and influences and imagination, African, Muslim, and Western. And what I argue is that an iconic archive, fills the archival space, over-determining it, making it hard for us to think outside and beyond it. And sometimes in the shadows is where we find some of the most interesting lessons. So I want to thank, I finish here. I look forward to questions. I want to thank all of you for listening to me. So let me stop share. There we go. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Susana, for this really insightful historical account of Timbuktu. I think we can clearly see how Timbuktu has been a geopolitical space, but also a space of resistance and appropriation, especially from the side of the West, and how this has continued through different periods of history. So thank you very much for that. I see we have questions in the Q&A. So please, for everyone who would like to ask your question personally, you can raise the hand, and then I can unmute you so you can directly ask the question to Susana. But so far, I'm just going to read the questions that we have in the chat. So the first one is, what are the present and future challenges of the archive in the current political instability in the country after 2 military coups in a short period?
Yeah, so I mean, this is an important question, and I think there are several, it works at several levels. The political instability in Mali has really been ongoing since of course, there's been political instability for quite a while, but really from the 2012-2013 crisis, it has just gone, escalated to a very rapid level. So one of the main problems now is that the huge number of the Timbuktu manuscripts are now in Bamako, which is the capital, which has a completely different, first of all, climate, but also context than Timbuktu. So in a sense, in Timbuktu, they were in their, one we could call natural environment, sort of where people, in terms of the families that had their collections still from the different families, and the in terms of the state repository of researchers that worked in the state repository. But now we find collections that are divided. So the state archive has half of its staff in Timbuktu, half of its staff in Bamako. They can't work efficiently like that because in Timbuktu, there's problems with electricity, with geopolitical problems. So it's a very inefficient way of working. The private collections that are in Bamako are the ones that are receiving so much attention that I've mentioned. They're the ones that are being digitized by by the German project and by the American initiative. But although some of them, for example, are being put online, they're really being, let's say, taken out of their context, which has been Timbuktu for all of this time. So what does that mean for future research? When I did the specific research, I went to Timbuktu. When you are part of the society, when you do your field work in a particular place, you're rooted in a certain culture. But now this is being uprooted and taken elsewhere where it has never been part of that environment. So what that will mean historically for future, it's yet to be seen. But yeah, I find it quite difficult. It's a quite difficult question to what will happen. Yeah.
Thank you, Susana. So the next question is how the Malayan society imagined the legacy of the manuscripts in its historical memory.
Yeah, that is a very good question. How Malian society views, and it's a very interesting one, because we have to think that, of course, in Malian society itself, there's almost a rupture. And you can really see that in terms of the educational system, which was imposed by the French after colonization. And of course, we know, I mean, it is true that the Islamic learning was for a certain elite, but at the same time, it had different levels. So although the manuscripts might have been written in Arabic, some of them, as I mentioned, are also written in African languages in the Arabic script, what is called Ajami. But very often the scholars would translate the manuscripts into local languages and in this way disseminate the knowledge. So it wasn't just a written culture, there was an oral tradition that accompanied it in terms of the dissemination of the knowledge with the manuscripts. So with the coming of the French and colonial education, we really see a rupture of this paradigm where education happens in French. The elites are taken to French. In terms of the association between the elites, let's say the intellectual elites, and this heritage. So for example, if you go to Bamako a few years ago and you go to the National Museum, you will see maybe 3 examples of manuscripts. It is still something that is not very well known. The relationship between the north of the country, let's say Timbuktu, and the southern part of the country is also a complicated one in terms of the political history, of the unification of the country. I mean, there's many layers. So it's in fact quite a complicated place of these manuscripts. I mean, there's great efforts in terms of revitalizing. There is now a department of Arabic studies at the University of Bamako, and the state repository, the Ahmed Baba Institute, is trying to recruit students to work, those students that have knowledge of the Arabic language to work on the manuscripts, but you need much more than knowledge of the Arabic language to be able to work with these manuscripts. So when they were based in Timbuktu, you had the scholars, the families that could interpret many other aspects of the manuscripts that don't just go along with textual analysis. So this is something that's still ongoing, and that at certain points, certain political figures will try to use these manuscripts to rally people behind them, to bring out our pride in our education, and so on, and in the splendors of our past. And for example, right now, I mean, very interestingly, I just attended a seminar in Mali online, in which people were trying to find, let's say, what were the ways in which the manuscripts help us resolve political conflict in the past that we could use for present needs. So these are the type of ways which current people in Mali are trying to incorporate the manuscripts for their current conditions.
Yeah, unfortunately, we see how post-colonial states are functioning, and this Timbuktu example is perfect of how local communities need to reappropriate their own knowledge and gain control over it, because the West has exploited and continued to do it. So, so yeah, really sad to hear that. Carlota is asking, well, it's a wonderful talk. Susana, could you please elaborate more on the Andalusian manuscript origin, status, and location? What is the involvement of Spanish institutions in preventing such a legacy? Any way this collaboration between Spain, Timbuktu, and UCT can be improved?
Okay, so thank you for the question. In fact, this particular collection that I mentioned, the Fondo Cati, or the Andalusi Library, was the one that I did my doctoral research on. So that is my real expertise. So I focused on this particular library. And, you know, it's a very, very long story, but the director of the library traces his ancestors to medieval Toledo. So one of his ancestors supposedly settled in the Niger Band, married into a local family of great scholars. And this library is supposed to be this legacy. So this was really taken up by the regional government of Andalusia, and at a certain point, and used by different players in very interesting ways. And this I discuss in detail and in my own research about how, for example, el Partido Andalucista used this to claim a particular identity for Andalusia in terms of its relationship to Africa, in the wake of, for example, much more immigration from North Africa, Muslim immigration in Spain, in this moment where Spain is trying to re-examine its own history in terms of the past. You know, Spain is often being said that it was made from the Reconquista, no? But what happens when now we have Otros Españoles? One of the titles of this by this author is Los Otros Españoles, and that is Los Españoles de Timbuktu. No? So, that was the idea behind the title of this book. So this Ismael Dita de Heydra, who's the director of this library, has really been able to use this discourse of Spain questioning its own history to raise a lot of funds for his collection, to help him. You saw the building of the library. Also, he's trying to digitize some of the manuscripts and to conserve them. But he is the one of the librarians who left Timbuktu after the 2012-2013 crisis, and he now lives in Granada, and he is still trying to raise funding for his library. But in fact, this the collection is more complicated than that. Some of the claims about this origin are not as simple as might be desired. And I find it that there's been quite a lack of interest by academics in Spain to take this collection seriously in terms of analyzing. So there was a lot of noise made about this collection in the public, in the newspapers, and there's popular books written about it, but there's been very scant academic attention paid to it. Although, of course, we know that in Spain, there's a great tradition of study of Al-Andalus and Arabic and manuscripts and so on. But there's something there that has happened, which I analyze in some of my writing, and it's quite interesting. So how do I see it in terms of sort of a future possible collaborations? Well, I'm happy to you know, I imagine one day I will present some of my work in Spain, perhaps, and try to bring that in the academic context, because I think it has had an effect at a certain level, in certain, for example, I mean, some of you might know the Almuzara publishing house, which has, you know, which is well known in certain contexts, that has published a lot of books on some of these themes, and some of these ideas have been revived, but it's been placed in a very particular political context. And I think it needs to be removed from that sort of place and opened up to wider scrutiny. So this is what I try to do with my work, and I'd be happy to share it in Spain at a later stage. Hopefully that could be interesting for me as well, and I hope for people in Spain as well. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Susana. We're just reaching the end of this webinar. I just want to say thank you for all the questions that were wonderful, and thank you for this amazing presentation. I think we have learned a lot about the myths and about the geopolitical space of Timbuktu. But I also think that with this question about the relation of Spain with Timbuktu, we can really see all the complexities of what it is, the connection between Africa and the Arab and the African world, and how those tensions perhaps are jeopardizing the production of knowledge in connections of historical accounts in between these three continents and locations. But once again, thank you very much for this really, really interesting talk. I think we will follow your work and keep posted with your latest publications to follow disentangle a space of Timbuktu in connection with Spain, but also in the African continent. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending the session.
Thank you to everyone, and thank you, Carmen, for a wonderful chairing, and all of you for attending, and thank you for the organizers for organizing this. Thank you, everyone.